Welcome back, folks. Still in chapter 4. Just got done with Freud, if you're going through the lectures in the way that I envisioned them. And we're going to continue with how science essentially constructed or continued to construct gender post-Freud. Good place to start is with the sex and personality, or the MF test, masculine feminine test, created by Lewis Terman and Catherine Cox Miles. What this survey was attempting to do was to codify what actually was masculine and what was feminine. The idea that was that gender identity is associated with attitudes, traits, and behaviors. Now, one of the things that we have to be considerate of and essentially remember is that when science starts to codify these things and they start to categorize these things, it really starts to define what we then consider gender norms, and then we begin to construct values based on these newly solidified gender norms that might not have been as solid before science starts to create rigid classifications of what it means to be masculine and what it means to be feminine. The MF test, it looked at many things as being gendered. Knowledge, of course. When you read the test, and this was pretty much distributed, I think the late 20s into the mid 1960s, you can see that it has a gender bias in and of itself. But something like gendered knowledge, red goes best with black, lavender, pink, or purple. If you know the answer to this, you're probably more likely to be representing the feminine. It essentially gave the idea that there were right and wrong answers that boys and girls would know and ultimately should know. Ideas like gendered feelings. One of the questions, does a fly caught on a sticky fly paper, a man who is cowardly and can't help it, and a wounded deer make you feel pity? Once again, this category was designed to elicit certain responses from males and certain responses from females. Another category would be gendered people. Some of the questions that you might encounter in this category would be, do you rather dislike to take your bath? Not sure. I guess boys would rather dislike that. Are you extremely careful about your manner of dress? Do you ever say do people ever say you talk too much? People say I talk too much regularly. Have you ever been punished unjustly? And have you ever kept a diary? These questions somehow should identify you as being either masculine or feminine, and somehow that's constructed as being either right or wrong. This also brings us into theories of cognitive development. Cognitive development being a development theory that essentially says that we're born gender neutral. So much to dispel some of the gender is natural. These folks say no, we're pretty much gender neutral when we come into the world, but it's through certain cognitive filters that we process and interpret information about gender. So essentially, what they're getting at here is through socialization, through how the other interprets our behavior, whether that's the generalized other or that's your father, your mother, your friends, your teachers, your pastors, how the other interprets your behavior is going to essentially give you the answers to what gender you actually are. It's going to socialize you into being a boy or a girl. Piaget, another educational theorist, educational psychological theorist, believed that children are actual active participants in socialization. And humans, we could say humans are active participants in socialization. Children are human, therefore we are all active participants in socialization. But children do interact with the process. And then, of course, Kohlberg argues that the developmental task of childhood is to label oneself male or female. So essentially the sole developmental task of childhood is to identify you as either being male or female. Kohlberg also discusses how children develop a gender mental filter. This does not come naturally. Kids need physical cues in their environments to help them identify with what gender they are part of. These things could be how they dress, how they, what is their hairstyles, or how they perceive body size, or how the society is perceiving their body size. And it's often believed by the age of 6, children see the world in gendered terms. Doesn't mean that you cannot raise a child gender neutral. There's a couple of examples in the textbook that talk about how families raised or attempted to raise their children gender neutral, and that pretty much worked up until the age of about 5 or 6, when they started to enter into the public school system, which then in turn wanted to identify them as either being male or female. And even though over time you can de-emphasize gender in the development of your children, society in and of itself is going to have an impact on how that child sees itself over time. So given all of the research, we now need to ask ourselves, what are the real, and not the imagined or produced, but the real psychological differences between men and women, if there are any at all? There's an argument that says there's probably not too many. Some of those differences are, there's more variation among men and among women than between men and women. This is a common understanding when we're talking about comparing differences between groups, whether that's comparing differences based on race, for example. What we find in the differences between whites and African Americans is usually there's less differences between Caucasians and African Americans than there are than there is within the categories themselves. So there's a greater range and difference within the Caucasian category and within the African American category than there is between the two categories themselves. This is the same way with gender, and we have to continue to remind ourselves that we are more similar than we are different. Now, many of the differences might not actually be natural differences, but they're the differences of how socialization impacts males versus females. Boys tend to be handled differently in our society. Boys tend to receive more physical punishment. There's often more concern over a boy being a sissy or an effeminate male than there is a girl being a tomboy. Boys are allowed to be more promiscuous than girls are, for sure. We consistently see different treatment of boys in the classroom, especially K through 6, and then girls in the classroom. So there are some significant differences in the way that we socialize boys to be masculine and girls to be feminine, and what that ultimately means. The social environments are also filled with gendered messages and gendered activities. So it's not just your own small little networks, it's the entire social milieu that is going to be telling you what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl, and the advantages and disadvantages of those meanings. In an effort to understand the attitudes, traits, and behaviors that constitute appropriate gender identity, some psychologists took it upon themselves to kind of elaborate and extend the masculine-feminine scale that we talked about earlier. And masculine and femininity became understood as 2 points on a spectrum. So were you an external masculine and were you an external masculine and internal feminine? Were you an external masculine, internal masculine? And they began to categorize gender that then could shed some light on potential behavior. I think the book talks about some of these theorists said that if you were externally a male and internally more identified with female, then you were much more likely to participate in dominant forms of things like racism, sexism, and things of that sort. So these classifications certainly were seen as important, and they could tell us something about whether the gendering process actually worked or did not work. Did you appropriately become or was the socialization process done in an appropriate way, that if you're a male, you are exhibiting masculine characteristics, and if you're a female, you're exhibiting feminine characteristics. Some sex roles theorists to keep in mind: Parsons, who saw the two masculinities, or the two genders, masculine and feminine, as being functional for society. We can also talk about the BIM sex role inventory, which explored the content of sex roles, and then started to talk about the concept of androgyny, and those that fell in between the polar oppositions of masculine and feminine were essentially the most psychologically well-adjusted. That's those males in touch with their feminine side, and those females in touch with their male sides. And Pleck, of course, talks about male sex role identity and argued that masculine sex role was inconsistent and it was contradictory.